So this is the Fujifilm X-T30. It's Fujifilm's latest APS-C X-Trans sensor. It's a baby brother to the X-T3 in that it has the same 26 megapixel back illuminated sensor. It's got the same image processor. It has the same autofocus system with phase detection over 99% of the sensor, and it has the same 4K video capabilities. But there are obviously differences, and in this video I'm going to look at them. Now, if you've seen my videos before, you know that I try to do my videos as practically as possible. I'm a landscape photographer. I also record videos like this. So what I'm really focused on is how this camera basically works when I'm shooting with it, and what the features mean to me as a camera to be taken with me in the field to shoot landscape and video. So I'm not going to be diving really into all of the technicalities and the specifications. It's not really that kind of video. And also, if you've seen any of my videos before, you'll know that I'm not at home. I'm still in the Faroe Islands. It's the morning, it's a little bit overcast. We're just about to go out shooting, but I wanted to see if I could get this review done first, because I've been carrying this camera around with me on this trip and been really impressed with it. Now, I have quite a long relationship with this line. The very first Fuji camera I ever bought was an X-T10, which I bought as a backup to my then Nikon D800E, and it was kind of what pulled me over into the Fuji system. I just liked the camera so much that I then bought an X-T1 and had the two side by side, and ever since then I've kind of always had a pair of them. So I had the X-T20 when I had the X-T2, and then now I've got the X-T30 alongside the X-T3, and I think the two cameras, for me, they work really well together. But I understand for a lot of people, they'll be looking at this whether to upgrade from an X-T20 or choosing between this and that. So what I'd like to look at in this video are the differences between those two cameras. So, as I've said, you've got the same sensor in here, you've got the same image processor and autofocus. So the image quality is indistinguishable in the cameras. You're not going to notice any difference whatsoever. The autofocus is exactly the same, and when you look at the video, you're going to see exactly the same video performance. Now, there are some small differences which I'll get into later, but overall, in terms of the actual output of image and video, they're identical, and yet this camera is less than 2/3 of the price. Now, at the moment, this is about 950 euros where I live, and this is about 1,450 euros. So yeah, a bit less than 2/3 of the price for effectively the same performance. Now, of course, there are going to be differences because this is Fuji's premium APS-C camera, and this obviously is a much more, not so much entry-level camera, but it's certainly further down the scale. So the first thing that you'll notice is it is, of course, considerably smaller, and there are pros and cons to this. It's a lot lighter at about 383 grams, so you're going to notice the weight when you carry it. It's exactly the same in terms of dimensions and weight to the X-T20. The only difference is a slightly different shape of the thumb grip here, but in every other way it's exactly the same. I use the same L bracket on this camera that I used on the X-T20, and you can still use the same grip. So in terms of build and shape and size, it's exactly the same as the X-T20, but smaller than this. Now, being smaller makes it obviously much easier to carry around. It's great to drop in your pocket. It's just easy for me. I love it as a backup camera because it takes up no space at all in my bag. If I want to use it as a second camera, put a different lens on it and shoot a scene from a different way, or if I want to record video while I'm using this camera. So the small and lightness is really nice. It makes it much more pocketable, much more portable, but it does lack the incredible, fantastic feel of the bigger camera. Now, I just find that the X-T3, the grip of it is perfect. It balances so well. It has a really nice heft. My hands fit really nicely in the grip. The grip's really nice and deep, and it just feels really great to hold. This doesn't. It's a lovely camera, but it doesn't, the grip here is a lot less shallow, so you can't really sink your fingers into it. And because the body here isn't so deep, I find that my little finger just kind of wafts around underneath. So to grip it, I have to kind of really crush my fingers up or have my finger underneath it. It's not bad, it's great. It's a lovely small camera, but it doesn't have the perfect fit in my hand that this camera does. Also, it doesn't have the same super sturdy build. This is weather sealed. You can look, the dials are a lot bigger, a lot more sturdy. Here the dials are smaller. It's still almost completely metal, so it does still look like a fantastically premium camera. It doesn't really feel plasticky at all. Everything here is metal. The dials are metal. It just doesn't have the same sturdy feel of this. But I don't really worry about how heavy duty this is, because while I can't actually speak to the X-T30, I've not been using it long enough. I did use the X-T20 for a long while in some pretty inclement weather and never had a problem with it. Last summer I was in Iceland and my X-T2 had a fall and really got quite banged up and smashed, and I couldn't use it anymore, so I had to revert to the X-T20 and use that for over a week in Iceland and photographing waterfalls where there was waterfall spray. It got very wet, it got rained on, it got dust in it, and it never had a problem. So if this has the same build as the X-T20, and I'm pretty sure it does, it's exactly the same chassis with exactly the same sealing, then while you have to be sensible with it, you're not going to be taking it out in heavy rain and you always want to be drying it off after you've used it, it's probably going to be fine in most weather conditions, as long as it's just, by most weather conditions, I mean most weather conditions where you would actually be out shooting. So, a little bit of rain, waterfalls, a little bit of ocean spray, it'll be fine. Now, it has the same touchscreen as the X-T3, which is to be expected because the X-T20 had a touchscreen also, the previous model of this, and I think, if I'm right, that the touchscreen on the X-T20 was the first touchscreen that Fuji ever introduced in their cameras. Now, that means that you've got the same functions on the touchscreen. You can navigate the menu with it, you can use it for autofocus, and those are things that I don't really use. I prefer to use the dials for that. But what is nice is also the touchscreen gives you can swiping through images, pinch to review images, and you can also use swipe to use as a function button, so you can swipe to change, to bring up, for example, the Fujifilm simulations or the histogram, or different things like that, which I find really, really useful. Like the X-T20, the screen articulates only in this direction, whereas on the X-T3 it also articulates in portrait mode as well. Now, this doesn't do that. I can totally understand why. Again, Fuji need to cut costs somewhere because it is a much cheaper camera, so it's perfectly understandable that they do make these kind of decisions, design decisions. But I do miss it a little bit. I do wish that this had portable portrait, that the screen tilted out in portrait mode, because I tend to shoot quite low to the ground quite often in portrait format when I'm really trying to bring in the foreground, and it's just really nice in that situation to be able to tilt the screen up and use it. But really, again, it's not a deal breaker. It doesn't really matter. Few other differences is it only has one card slot. This has two card slots, and the card slot is here alongside the battery rather than here in the door. This is again exactly the same as the X-T20, and like the X-T20, Fuji have put in this kind of door that doesn't latch close. This is a kind of personal beef of mine, a peeve. I've kind of mentioned it in the X-T3 review and probably the X-T20 review. I do much prefer the latch on the X-T3 where it just closes on its own, whereas this you actually have to slide it closed. It's a tiny thing, but it kind of bugs me a little bit because I don't think it really makes that much difference to make it latch close. And it makes it much easier. It doesn't get caught in your bag and you find it open or the battery fall out. This probably will happen to me maybe once or twice in the entire lifetime of this camera, so I really don't know why I'm mentioning it, but maybe it's just tradition in the reviews that I do of Fuji's smaller cameras. Now, it has smaller dials than the X-T3, which make it not quite so easy to operate with gloves. They don't have the depth or the height you can see here. They're not quite as sturdy. The clicking isn't quite as solid, but it's still fine. And it doesn't have a dedicated ISO dial here on the left. The dial here is just for the drive, so a single or high-speed shooting or video, things like that. The ISO dial, the ISO basically, you can access it in different ways. And what I tend to do is put it on this function button here. So on the dial at the back, I just click that and that brings up the ISO, and then you can just scroll through the ISO. I've always done this on the previous cameras. I find it really intuitive and I don't really miss the dial at all. It's very easy to operate. And I ended up doing this when I used the GFX 50R as well, because that doesn't have a dedicated ISO dial. And for me, it's just a really intuitive way of changing ISO. It's not something that I particularly miss. A couple of things that it does have that the X-T3 doesn't. It does have a pop-up flash. Again, this is the same as the X-T20 and X-T10. Now, I've never used this ever. I'm a landscape photographer, so it's not really important to me, but it is something that's there. And it also has a button here on the side of the shutter dial, which flicks the camera into full auto. Now, you can basically do the same thing on the X-T3. You just have to put the shutter dial in auto, and you have to put the ISO in auto, and you have to put the aperture dial on the lens, the aperture button on the lens in auto. This basically has a button that flicks it and puts everything in automatic. And that's really because this camera is targeted at much casual users. For more professionals or semi-professionals, you're probably never going to use this. But if you just want to use this as a point and shoot, as a carry around, then basically that's there for you. Now, when you look at the back of the camera, this is when you start to see differences between the X-T3 and the previous X-T30. The first thing that you notice is that it doesn't have a D-pad anymore. The X-T20 had a D-pad. That's been replaced with a joystick. The X-T3, of course, has both the joystick and the D-pad. So that means I much prefer the joystick because I don't like touch to focus. So I found that on the X-T20, when I was using the D-pad to focus, and it's not as intuitive as using the dial. I tend to use the dial on the X-T3, so I really like that. The way that I focus on both cameras is now exactly the same. You can move very quickly through the menu using the joystick. So for me, this is a big improvement, the joystick replacing the D-pad. And the other change over the X-T20 is that the Q button, it used to be kind of there. It's now been moved onto the back of the thumb grip. Now that's fine. I do find, because when I'm gripping it, my thumb kind of sometimes tends to roll onto it, and I bring up the Q menu when I don't need to, but before it was kind of there. So it really depends how you use your thumb. You just have to change it the way you put the pressure in your thumb, because with the X-T20 I occasionally found myself activating the key menu as well. But yeah, it's a small difference that's worth mentioning. But all these differences really, as I said before, they're completely understandable. It's not a premium camera, and for me it's amazing that Fuji have done this. They've given you this, this identical image quality. So the cuts that they have to make are, for me, ones that don't really interfere with the way that I work, and ones that I don't mind at all, because as I said, you get exactly the same performance. Now, just to talk about that image performance a little bit. First of all, I'll talk about video, because I think that's where the biggest differences are. The X-T30 will shoot 4K in the same way that the X-T3 does, but there is a small difference. This will shoot it at 60 frames per second and this only at 30 frames per second. And it doesn't have internal 10-bit. Now 10-bit just gives you a wider color gamut, which means that you have much more better tonal graduations, much more highlight graduations. It can shoot it when it's connected to a HDMI cable, but it can't shoot it internally in the camera when you're not connected. And because I'm out hiking a lot, I'm not carrying HDMI, that kind of equipment with me. So really, it means that I can't shoot 10-bit in this camera, and I can with that. But I can still shoot in F-Log, which is a really big deal, which I'll talk about in just a sec. It also has a shorter time recording limit to the X-T3. So it will shoot 4K for 10 minutes and Full HD for 15 minutes. This is basically double that. It shoots 4K for 20 minutes and Full HD for half an hour. But the video features on this are considerably better than the X-T20. I think that's where the differences are the most noticeable, and for me why this camera is such a massive improvement, simply because it shoots F-Log. Now F-Log is basically like a raw file in video. It just gives you a very flat profile and records a much wider range of detail. You've got a lot more data in it, which means you can color grade it in different ways, and there's a lot more flexibility in the file. Now, the problem before that I had is that I shoot quite a lot of F-Log with my drone and with my main camera, the X-T2 and now the X-T3. And if I was using the X-T20, I was forced to use the Fujifilm simulations. So the video output that I was getting was very different, which made it very difficult to edit videos to give them a consistent feel across the entire video. Now that I can use F-Log, it means that the video, all the different video output that I have from the drone, from this camera, all looks the same, and it gives me it makes it much easier to grade it to get all of the images looking consistent. So that means that when I pick this camera up and shoot video, I know that the video is going to look exactly the same as that. It also shoots 120 frames per second, so that's real slow motion, but again, that's only in Full HD, which is just the same as this camera. Now, for still image quality, it's exactly the same as this. You're really not going to notice a difference. And in terms of comparison with the X-T20, there's really not a lot of difference either. Now, when I compared this to the X-T2 in a review I made earlier this year, or at the end of last year, I really noticed that you don't see a huge amount of difference between the files out of the X-T2 and the X-T3. They're very, very similar. The differences really are mostly in video and autofocus. So if you're thinking of upgrading from the X-T20 to this just for video quality, you're not going to see a huge amount of difference. But that's not really a bad thing. The X-T20 had amazing image quality, and so does this. One thing that is different is that the base ISO on this and the X-T3 is 160, whereas on the previous generation, the X-T20 and X-T2, it was 200. Now, what does this mean in reality? It doesn't actually mean anything in reality. I think that some people can often get confused. They think because they know that higher ISOs mean more noise, there's an assumption that if a camera has a base ISO of 200, it is therefore noisier than a camera which has a base ISO of 100, but that's not the case. Base ISO that is basically the place where the image performs best. So it's where you've got the best signal to noise ratio. So it's where the camera has the least amount of noise, probably the greatest amount of dynamic range, and it's really where the sensor is functioning at its most efficient. Now this is different on different cameras. On the X-T2, on the X-T20, it was 200. On previous cameras that I've owned, on the Nikon D300, on the Nikon D3, the base ISO was also 200. On this, it's 160. It means it's no different really. It just means that the performance of this camera at ISO 160 is the same as the X-T20 was at ISO 200. You're not going to see more noise. That's just not the case. All right, so now let's have a look at the quality of the image and the video. Now, if you've seen my X-T3 review, it's pretty much the same, but if you haven't, then let's have a quick dive in to see what you can expect when you're using this camera. So this is the first image. It was taken on a trip to Tuscany when I had the X-T30 with me. And the point of this image is it was taken with the kit lens with the XF 18-55, just to give you the kind of idea that you would get with the X-T30 kit. There's a lot of detail here. Now this is a backlit scene. It's quite hazy because it's first thing in the morning when there's a lot of mist around, mist and haze, but you can see the amount of detail on these trees here. And when we look over in the background at the trees along the ridge here and on the back here, just this level of detail and contrast is really quite pleasing. And as I said, that's taken with just the X-T30 and the basic kit lens. Just to look at something a little bit more complex, this is taken in the Faroe Islands and it's shot with the wide angle with the 10-24. Please don't criticize me for this gentleman here. I had no idea who he was. He was just someone who came and walked into the shot when we were shooting there. It was an incredibly dangerous thing to do because there's a really sheer drop pretty much right in front of him. But the light was really good at that particular moment, and I just wanted to capture the scene when we had that light anyway. So he's a fixture of this image. But anyway, the point of this image is just to give you an idea of the kind of dynamic range that you can get. Now, as you can see, this is taken at sunset with the setting sun just off to the right of the camera. And when we press J there, you can see the highlights. Now let's just have a look at what we can pull back. Now, if I just go all the way down with the highlight slider, let's just zoom in there. And again, let's pull down the exposure, and you can see that it really does. There's actually almost no detail being lost there at all. The reduction of highlights is very pleasing. And because I was shooting into the light here, we've got a lot of lost shadow down here. So let's see what we can do with the shadows there if we push them out. Again, you can see that it's recorded really quite a huge amount of detail across the scene. Obviously, that looks very flat, but there is a lot of data there. The sensor is recording a lot of data that would allow me to make something of this image. Now, as it happens, because when I'm shooting in these kind of situations, I always bracket, so I do have underexposed and overexposed shots, which give me much more control of the highlights and the shadows. But just in one shot, that gives you an idea of the kind of dynamic range that you can expect. This is another example of this. Now, this was taken it was really hazy. There was all kinds of nasty things going on with the light. And the sun was very low on the horizon, and I really did want to capture this. Didn't have anything interesting going on in the sky. So it's a long exposure with a lot of blown highlights, and just to save you the time of going all the way through it. Now, it's certainly not a finished image, but it does give you an idea of the amount of detail that you can manage to pull back and pull out of a shot, which really I didn't think it was possible to get a shot. We were there it wasn't particularly close to the end of the day. It was about 2 hours before sunset, although the sun was quite low. And standing at the scene, I really didn't think that I'd be able to get anything at all because of the huge amount of haze and how brightly backlit the scene was. But the camera actually does pull out quite a lot of detail. Now, it's by no means a great image, but it does give you an idea of what you can get out of the camera sensor. This is another example of the dynamic range. Again, really brightly lit scene. I've shot lots of scenes like this at the time that I've been a photographer on all kinds of coasts like Scotland and Iceland, and usually these, you usually do need to bracket them. But again, you can see here when we look at it, we can pull down the highlights, and there's absolutely, just look at the histogram up there. There's just no detail lost whatsoever here or in the water. The camera's managed to capture the entire shot in one scene. This is another image from Tuscany. Again, this is the kind of image that I would normally bracket. This is part of a bracketed group of exposures. but it just gives you an idea. Again, this is stacked, so you can see the histogram is stacked to the right here, but there is a huge amount of data. I can quite easily pull the shadows out. I can quite easily drop down the sky and darken the sky a little bit, and there's a large amount of data that's actually been recorded on the sensor. So the sensor does perform incredibly well. It's got a really nice dynamic range. If we zoom in, we can see the amount of detail that the camera is recording. This is taken with the 55 to 200, which again, it's not a particularly expensive lens. It's a lens that I carry because it's lightweight and small. It's great for having a lightweight small kit, but you can see the amount of detail that it's pulling out here in the church and the buildings around it. Now, I didn't actually in the Faroe Islands or Tuscany have an opportunity to shoot at high ISO, so what I'm going to do is show you this image, which was actually shot with the X-T3, not the X-T30. But because it has exactly the same sensor and exactly the same processor, this is the kind of performance that you would expect. It would have been identical had I shot it with the X-T30. This is shot at ISO 2000. It's straight out of the camera. I've done nothing at all to combat the noise. I've done nothing at all to pull out the detail. But you can see here the kind of detail that I was getting. And this is shot at ISO 2000. Now, there certainly is noise in the sky, and there's also a little bit of light fall off, but the noise isn't the kind of noise that's difficult to deal with. And certainly there's plenty of detail being pulled out. And for an aurora shot, which is basically when I would be using high ISO as a landscape photographer shot, as a landscape photographer, I really don't have much need to use it other than when I'm shooting at night. This is certainly as good as I would need and very satisfactory. So this is just an example of the video that you would expect from the X-T30 that I shot in the Faroe Islands. This is shot in F-Log, and then you can see what it looks like when it's been graded. And there really has just been such a huge improvement in video in these cameras. Certainly from the X-T10, which had terrible video, and yet much better than the X-T20. Now we can use F-Log. And this is a really very capable video camera, and also a very capable stills camera. The quality that I've been getting from this camera really is incredibly good. Alright, so that's pretty much it. So for me, the X-T30 is a really great camera. It continues Fuji's tradition of taking all of the features of their top of the line high-end cameras like the X-T3 or the X-T2 and putting them in a much smaller, much more affordable body. And I think it's just a great thing that Fuji do. Now, whether you should go with this, the X-T30 or the X-T3, really depends on how important those differences are to you. So if it's just the image quality or the video quality that you care about, then this is a really great option. But if you really need the things like that, if you really want a bigger camera with a better grip, if you want the 2 card slots, or the smaller things like the way that the screen articulates, or just a sturdier body, then you're probably going to prefer this. Whether you should go with this or the X-T20 really depends in that case on how important video is to you, because in terms of the image quality, you're not going to see a huge amount of difference. But the video in this is absolutely exceptional and considerably better, much better than you got with the X-T20, just because of the introduction of log. It's also got much better autofocus. So if you find yourself shooting objects that are moving a lot quicker, then this is a great option and probably worth the upgrade from the X-T20. Now for me, it makes an absolutely brilliant backup camera. I really like being able to switch between the 2 cameras and not notice any difference between the images that I'm using and not notice any difference between the video output. So I can use this video while I'm using that, use that while I'm in, and then switch to this and know that the footage is going to come out looking fantastic. And because it's so small, so tiny, it fits in my bag and I really don't notice it's there, and it just gives me that extra option when it comes to shooting. So anyway, that's it for this review. I hope it's been useful and I hope it's been interesting. If you've got any comments or any questions, just send me an email or drop me a comment and I will try to get back to you. This afternoon, hopefully we're going to get out and do some shooting, and in the meantime, thanks for watching, and as ever, take care.